So this is the moment that I have been waiting for, and hopefully it's one that you've been anticipating too. This is going to be the video where we discuss the Aries Ingress for 2024. Now, in traditional astrology, the Aries Ingress, when the sun comes into that 0 degree of Aries, we get the beginning, the birth of a whole new zodiacal year. So this can be considered the astrologer's new year. And what we do with this is, again, it's a birth of a new year. So what that becomes is the sort of natal chart for that year from this Aries ingress to the next one. Just like your solar return chart is from your solar return, typically on your birthday, sometimes a day or two off, mostly just like one day off by a couple hours. And then from the birthday to the next birthday for that year for you. So this is the solar return birthday of the year. And so what we're going with here is the sun coming into Aries, and we're looking at a couple different factors to decide what do we need to look at here? What factors, what places, what planets are the most influential, and what is the condition of the year? Typically, most what they would consider, there were some considerations called klimas for areas of the world that were impacted, but also if you cast the chart in your location, you would get to see the condition of the people, the general public, and also the rulership, which was referred to in traditional astrology as the king and the rustics. So the king, the one who was calling all the shots, and the rustics, the people who made up the general population. You would look at those conditions of both of those groups to see in combination with the rest of the chart how that year was going to go for those two. So with that in mind, we are going to be looking and consulting the likes of Ptolemy, Abu Mashar, Masha Allah, and William Ramsay. Not all of them will be directly quoted, but I will try to attribute different techniques where I can remember them and where I have them cited in my notes, so you'll know who said what about which thing. And we're going to look at a couple different charts, one being the actual Aries ingress. Fortunately, and I will explain why, we only need the Aries ingress to look at the condition for the year. We will also look at the pre-ingress lunation, which is important, just like a prenatal lunation is often considered, and I'll explain why for that as well. And then we're also going to look at the Aries ingress in comparison to the Sibley chart, which is the sort of more accepted chart for the birth of the United States, since that is the nation that we are living in. And we want to see how this year goes with our natal chart as a nation, with the natal promise that we have there. So there's a lot to explore. There's a lot to look forward to. And there is a lot that I'm going to be going into where I'm going to be trying to be as impartial as possible. Because we all live here, because we are all human beings leading human lives, having preferences and having desires and having priorities that are very unique to us, I am going to try to be as impartial as possible. And that includes removing my own biases or preferences or desires from my interpretation. So please keep that in mind, that while as a human being, I do have desires, opinions, and all of these things, for the purposes of interpreting this chart in as fair a way as possible, I am going to do my best to remove those biases and approach the chart from an objective perspective using the qualities and temperaments of the planets and the signs to give us an indicator of which direction for positive or challenging things are going. So with that said, now we can begin diving into some charts. And the first thing I'm going to pull up is my Luna. And this first chart we are going to see here is the Aries ingress of the Aries equinox. Yes, Luna is going to say spring equinox right here, but not for everybody. This is actually the beginning of fall for people in the Southern Hemisphere. So I like to stick with Aries equinox because that includes the entire sphere of the Earth and what they are experiencing. So we know this is the Aries ingress chart because the sun is at 0 degrees Aries and 0 minutes. And so already you're starting to see, there are some connections here that may play into our interpretation. You are correct. And so one of the things that we're going to say is this is the foundational chart. This is the chart that is the birth of the year. Now we are going to go into additional and supplementary charts that give us more context, even more flavor. And so I kind of want to go with this. And because of that, I'm going to start with the pre-ingress lunation so that we can look at that. And that is actually something that is happening on the 11th of March. And it is the pre-ingress lunation happening on, the 10th of March with the new moon in Pisces down here. So what we want to do is look at this new moon in Pisces and say, okay, what is this moon? And when we understand this new moon, just like we do on YouTube every 2 weeks or so with the new moons, we're going to do that here, knowing that that's setting a tone. It's kind of like the ensoulment, the pre-birth. So this is not what every astrologer believed, but there are some astrologers who believed that the lunation before birth was when the spirit came into the body preparing to be born. It is a good example of the nature of how we use this interpretation. So while the prenatal lunation may not be the ensoulment of the body, we don't know for sure. There are other theories as to when the soul comes into the body, believe it or not. So for this one, though, we are saying that this is sort of breathing life is going to become the Aries ingress. This is setting the tone. This is the sun and the moon having their meeting. And during this lunar cycle, we will have a new year. So this is the space that is for this new year to come into, which is a really nice way to look at it. So when we look at this prenatal lunation or pre-ingress lunation, there are some things that we would point out. First, it is occurring in Pisces. So the sun and the moon are in Pisces, which brings out a natural assumption of Piscean themes. Piscean themes are depth. Pisces is a mutable water sign, right? So we're thinking highly emotional. We're thinking mutable, so changing and beginning and finishing kind of energies. So it is kind of like the tides of the ocean, the depths of the sea. We're thinking Poseidon level ocean stuff here when we think about Pisces. Certain things here can be certain melancholies, certain peace efforts, certain peace focuses. Pisces is ruled by Jupiter, so there is a sort of benefic oomph here. The reason I bring into a little bit of melancholy is that Saturn is present here, and so is Neptune. Neptune, by a more modern rulership, would be given rulership of Pisces. If you are someone who gives modern rulership to the outer planets, that's the general consensus. I stick with Jupiter as being the ruler of Pisces, but I do notice and I do give weight to the fact that outer planet cycles are important. So one of the things that you've probably already heard about is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction that will be occurring, kind of tripping across the cusp and Aries. So we have Saturn that is on his way to meet up with Pisces sometime next year, and I'll be talking about it a lot closer when it approaches. And then Saturn and Neptune will conjoin, and then right at that 0 degree of Aries, we are going to see them actually have their conjunction. So at the 0 and 1 degree of Aries, we have the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which is going to be giving us this new cycle of the bending and wonkiness of borders and confusion and structure in confusion that we will see with Neptune dissolving borders and making things more ephemeral, and Saturn coming in and saying, yeah, but combine that with structure boundaries. So we're already seeing this in a lot of ways where we see, as an example, regulations being put to things like AI. You have to define, in some senses, what is consciousness? I've seen articles about that even this week. These topics will likely become more prevalent and more will likely emerge between now and next year when this conjunction occurs. And so what's happening right now with this pre-lunation of the Aries ingress is we're kind of highlighting that because the moon are both here with this new moon. The moon, of course, translating the stars to us where we can feel it more effectively. Now bringing Saturn and Pisces together with Neptune in Pisces so that we can sort of get a feel for what conjunction will bring. So it's really interesting to think around this time, around March 10th, what themes are coming up that may be hallmarks of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Now, so that's something that we can think about there. We also see that when we single out the sun and the moon, there is this sextile aspect that the sun and the moon are separate from Uranus. They are separating from Jupiter, but they have this sextile sign-based aspect. While they have the conjunction with Saturn and Neptune, they are still talking to Jupiter and also Uranus. So again, with this abundance of change that might be coming along with it. So those are some things that we can think about. It also, I want to make sure we point out, speaking of outer planet cycles, the one that the ancients knew about and also focused on was, of course, the two outermost planets that they were aware of, and that is Jupiter and Saturn. And as we can see, Jupiter and Saturn are now just barely separating from a repeat of their sextile that happened last year as well. And this is their first aspect they get to make with each other, the sextile aspect, since they actually conjoined and began a new social cycle for us at the 0 degree of Aquarius in 2020 on the winter solstice. It was kind of unique that it fell on that perfect day as well. And so what we see now is that that point, that degree where this between Saturn and Jupiter is now speaking to itself as it progresses, but also that degree of 0 degrees Aquarius is getting a little bit of attention from Pluto. So some things that we can think about are the fact that these are the year 2020 throwbacks to where we were at then and what we began then, what we as a society shifted into when that shift happened. And it was a pretty stark one. It was the first time in 800 years that the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter would have occurred in an air sign. And it was that shift from Earth signs that would have occurred for 200 years into a 200-year air cycle. So while it is not the age of Aquarius, as far as zodiacal ages are considered, it is an era of prominent Aquarian themes, especially since Pluto now follows into Aquarius as well. So again, we're kind of throwing back to 2020. One of the ways that I've personally been thinking about this sextile, which by the end of the year, will become a square between Saturn and Jupiter. Jupiter is going to move into Gemini May 25th and then approach the degree to be able to square Saturn in Pisces. What we're doing now is just like the moon, when she comes into light again after a new moon, we're awakening from this. We're realizing that there's light to be had here, that there are things that we can recognize what occurred before. And now we have some decisions to make. We are coming out and emerging from a hibernation that feels like the blur from 2020 until now. And some of those themes are repeating. We are revisiting some of those themes, even in the headlines this previous week, where the way we did things in 2020 are now being revisited, reassessed, and changing for either optimism or for challenge, depending on your preferences and where you are in your own process with that. So I encourage you always to make sure that you check in with yourself and say, where am I on this? How does this feel for me? And what do I need to do to protect my peace? Which is another great theme for this lunation happening in Pisces. It's also notable that Saturn, who is having this experience, is also right around the heliacal rise, about 15 degrees away from the sun. So Saturn is having morning rise, which means if you were to get up before sunrise and look into the eastern horizon, before the light of the sun made the sky impossible to see stars, you would be able to see Saturn. So Saturn is now visible and able to fulfill Saturn's functions as they are in Pisces. At this time, during the new moon, you can see how we're layering on here with that. So we are waking up from the themes of 2020, throwing back and saying, what are my boundaries? What are the things that I need to do to maintain my comfort? Where do I need to draw my lines? And what does that mean? And so we're also seeing that reflected in society, as we already are. So let me just check on my notes here before we move on. And okay, and also throwing back over to Pluto here at that degree, Saturn currently rules Pluto as well. And so we may be noticing themes again with this Saturn-Neptune theme of confusion with boundaries and the Pluto and Aquarius themes of things such as AI, or I've even seen like lithium being a new fuel source be popular. And so we're going to be seeing some emphasis on those things around this time as well. This really big emergence of prominent themes for Pluto and Aquarius, emphasized by the fact that Saturn is also very strong. Okay, and I think with that, we get to move on. The last thing I will mention is that at this time, Jupiter, who is the ruler of the lunation, pre-lunation for the entire year, in that conjunction with Uranus, which will perfect on April 20th, which is going to bring another social change. Just as Saturn and Neptune getting together is something of note, two outer planets here, Jupiter and Uranus getting together, is something of note too. Jupiter expands, Uranus changes things or revolutionizes things or brings stroke of genius. So we might see some fundamental changes in the process that we use for, I would say, our natural resources with the Taurean themes here. We might see some big changes on the way, drawing closer and closer, becoming more and more obvious between now and April 20th, and then we will react and respond to those after that. Okay, so that is our pre-Aries ingress lunation analysis, that resources and connection and consciousness seem to be very important for the year already. Let us jump into the Aries ingress itself. Okay, so this is our Aries ingress. We are back to the chart that we were looking at first. Now we have the added wisdom of what we were seeing with that new moon. Now you can see we've moved a little bit far from this. The sun has made it all the way into Aries, where the sun is exalted. So that's something to note right away. The sun is, of course, exalted in Aries, and the moon has made it over to Leo, which is ruled by the sun. This is going to come into play later. The first thing we do when looking at the revolution of the year, which is another word for the Aries ingress, is we try to figure out who's the boss. So this is called the Lord of the Year. And so when we're thinking about who's the boss of the year, naturally, if you have some experience in astrology, even with your own natal chart, your first inclination might be, well, the ruler of the ascendant. That is the first thing that we do look at. And then several astrologers have various different criteria for how to go beyond that. If the ruler of the year isn't in the domicile, on the ascendant, and just showing up super prominently saying, yep, I steer this ship, how do you decide who gets to be the ruler past that? Again, multiple criteria, multiple versions of criteria from different astrologers, some of whom we've mentioned being Ptolemy, Abu Mashar, Masha Allah, and many others. And this year we are fortunate because when I, along with my mentor, went through this chart and tried to decide who's the boss, it really did still fall into the hands of the ruler of the ascendant, who is Mars down here at the IC. Because though Mars is not on the ascendant, Mars is on one of the angles, which gives him sort of a leg up. He has this strength of being angular. And you may be noticing Jupiter is at an angle as well. This is where an interesting thing comes in, where our whole sign astrology also borrows and respects some pieces of what I'm going to refer to as the equal house system, where we have to understand that the ascendant actually would become the first, the border or the cusp of the first house case. And in an equal sign system, that would put the first house from 16 degrees Scorpio to 16 degrees Sagittarius. And it would make it so that if that planet is close and approaching, or if the ascendant or the angle approaching the planet because they move faster. So that would be important. Whereas in this case, let's say the IC in an equal house system would go from 25 degrees-ish, 25 degrees of Aquarius to 25 degrees in Pisces. Mars inside that IC, that fourth house, is what the cusp would be. However, over here, when we look at the DC, the descendant would begin the seventh house at 16 degrees Taurus and go into the next 16 degrees of Gemini, which means that Jupiter would not be in that angular house. So that's something that we take into account, saying Mars would still be on the angle. Jupiter is considered very closely, but considered to be falling away. And that's another thing we'll talk about when we get up to the moon, because the moon is in the 10th whole sign house, but by equal sign, it would actually be in the 9th. So it's a consideration that we do take while we're looking at this, because it's not yet understood fully if ancient astrologers used multiple house systems in tandem. I personally, from my reading, believe they may have. I think it's important to keep in mind and to keep in consideration, because the sky doesn't care about the lines we draw on it. So we're going to take these things into consideration, knowing that the people who originally understood these definitions may have been using those techniques. And so the more we want to understand, the more we keep our minds open. All right, so with that, now we have decided that Mars is the Lord of the year. Mars, the lesser malefic, is the Lord of the year. And we think, first of all, what does that mean for us, right? If Mars, this ambitious, fiery, warlike planet, is the Lord of the year, what does that bring? Again, we're going to say that astrology is archetypally predictive. And so we're going to look at these keywords and we are not going to let them make us panic, okay? This actually is not the most challenging ingress that I've seen or that I have studied with my mentor. And honestly, it's it's got a better quality to it than years, and it's got a better quality to it than some years that will follow. And we will get to those when they arrive, and we will think ahead to them. And I still don't think that it's anything to panic about. I encourage you to just know that you are in your space and you have full power and control in your space over your actions, and you can respond to circumstances in a way that you decide. So always keeping that in mind, even though Mars is prominent in this chart, and that shows things for the nation as a whole that will affect us. I'm not going to discount that. What happens to the nation does affect us as individuals, but we have so much more power in our own spheres of influence than our panic might make us believe if we just look at a chart and freak out over an aspect of it. So with that in mind, just know you are still empowered, and we're going to keep going talking about this. So with Mars as the Lord of the year, we talked already about Mars being the Lord of the first house and angular. This is something that most astrologers would agree on, but I am going to cite Mashallah on this because it's the one I was using when I came up with this. The strength of him as the Lord of the year, though he is angular, it's not our favorite place for a Lord of the year to be, to say that it's a very strong and forward energy. Ideally, the Lord of the year would be on the ascendant in their domicile, like right at this 16 degrees of Scorpio, if it would be Mars. This is actually not even like, I think the hierarchy goes, if you don't have it in the ascendant, you move on to the 10th house, you move on to the 7th house, and then you do move on to the 4th house or the house of the earth. From there, you could even do the 11th house, the 9th house, the 5th house, and the 3rd house. And so you can see how it's like, well, if it's not there, maybe it's over here. Well, if it's not, further and further away we get from this prominent point at the ascendant, the less influence that planet, the less strength that planet has. So it is considered to be Mars here being a little bit weak, being on the angle of Earth. Now, the angle of Earth, the IC, does bring in certain themes that will be important. And the other main player here that we're going to keep an eye on is, of course, the luminaries, the moon, and the sun. So we're really keeping our eye on Mars, the moon, and the sun for the purposes of this video. And so now we say, okay, we have the general thing this year. What did I say? What are they telling us about the year? So when we look at this, we look at typically the people who live in the nation, and those would be the king, the ruler of the nation, and the rustics or the general population of the nation, us. And so when we look at the king, the first thing you do is look at the ruler of the midheaven and the midheaven itself, and also the sun. Now, for anybody here who knows their rulerships, that's actually really easy this year because Leo is the midheaven. And so the sun is the ruler of Leo. So this is very interesting that we actually don't have as many factors to factor in because the sun gets to be both the ruler of the midheaven and the sect-light that we look to for the king. So we can just go from here and observe the condition of the sun and the sun's ability to do solar things, to bring about that rulership. Now, the sun is in the 6th house. The sun is exalted, so that is inevitable in an Aries Ingress chart, but also very strong for the king. Again, inevitable, the king has influence and is exalted by the people one way or another. And I am saying the king to remind us of what mindset these concepts were developed under. The world has gotten to be a much smaller place by influence, but bigger place by territory and lands. So it's a different kind of thing. And if we have to equate the king to a president or to a ruler in this sense, knowing that it's not a kingdom, it's a combination of multiple states or kingdoms. But we do have this to work with. And so that's what we're going to kind of look into. All right, so with the sun being Aries, how strong is the sun by position and by support from other planets? So we're looking at the sun saying, yep, exalted. However, the sun is in the sixth house. Now, the sixth house is the house of illness and infirmities, work and service, and physical health. So it's not surprising, this is where astrology is not going to surprise you, that our candidates for leadership this year, the people that we look to as our leaders, the question of their firmness or health has been a topic, has been important to people, and will probably continue to be important as people look to the king and make their decisions and their opinions about the king or ruler this year. So it is important to think about. It's also important to note that we have the eclipses happening in a prominent place this year as well, where the king is and opposite of the king. So the Libra and Aries nodes showing us that we're going to have Libra and Aries eclipses throughout the year. And just knowing that that will likely affect where the king is and what the king is doing, because the king is also in that same sign and house in this case as the North Node. So we will see in the Aries eclipse that happens on April 8th, a little bit more that may be drawn into this. And of course, as I go throughout the year and do more with our astrology, I may hearken back to the Aries Ingress to remind you of something in the chart that is being activated, because it is known in mundane astrology that when planets go through changes or phases or transits of certain sorts, which we'll talk about soon, that this could activate the natal chart, just like transits and phases and timings activate our natal charts as well. So the ingress is just like a natal chart for this nation and the world at this time in this place. So now we're going to say, okay, we're looking at the topic of how firm or able is this person to fulfill the position of the house of the king or the influencer or the president. And another notable thing here that has a couple meanings that are interesting to note because they are keywords. The presents is the secondary indicator of the people. So the first indicator of the people is going to be Mars as the ruler of the chart and the Lord of the year, but also the moon. So the sun typically represents the king, the moon typically represents the people. We understand that. And so we're saying, wow, the moon is, in this chart at least, hanging out in the king's space. And so this to me shows a focus of the people on the office or on the position of the king. And it, of course, is an election year. So that is something that is going to be a prominent topic. Again, not surprising, but there's a lot of confirmation here, an affirmation to the experience that we are living. Another thing that is interesting that I'm coming up with now is that the moon, of course, also reflects the mind. And so while we have this separating trine with the sun and the moon, perhaps it's the infirmness or the quality of health of the mind that is the top. Which again, if you look at the headlines for whichever candidate you choose, that is the hot topic for them. So again, we could be seeing that reflected here, and this could continue to be the topic of primary interest in this cycle of choosing the people, being able to put someone in the place of the president or king. So let me just refer to my notes here really quickly. When we look at the sun in the sixth house, I do want to do a quick quote from William Ramsey, who actually gives so much more straightforward attention to specific positions of planets in the ingress chart or the revolution of the year than many of the astrologers before him did. So Ramsey says, if he, the sun, is in the sixth, many grievances and infirmities happen. This is the nature of the sixth house that he is bringing in here. And chiefly in the eyes, the sun would be an indicator of the eyes, as is Aries. Aries in part of the body that is the head and the eyes. And such living creatures shall die as are dignified by the sign wherein he is located. That's, living creatures of Aries. And so we are looking also, or chief rulers shall be sad that year. Much loss, also damage shall be by servants, and such things are as are signified by the sixth house. Also, the ignoble and baser sort of people shall envy and raise themselves up against their superiors. Now, this is on page 75 of the William Ramsey Astrologia Mundi document. And I want to emphasize again, this is not necessarily something we're not already seeing. So even though it sounds very martial, Aries, Sun, sixth house, like a lot of these topics, these keywords are being brought together. And so we are synthesizing them into a statement of what could be. Now, taking that archetype and saying, well, what's going on? There is a lot of focus right now on people trying to decide what democracy looks like for them, what they want the state of America's government to look like moving forward. So a lot of these things we are already seeing. Also, there's a lot of people exercising their right to protest or to unionize. And so that also can show that people are raising themselves up against their superiors. There are a lot of ways this can show up. So the reason I cite it is so that you can come back and see how it did show up and if you notice it. So noticing this quote, come back later, revisit this if you see something that makes you remember this video and say, oh, wow, that might have been indicated by the sun being in the sixth house in Aries in the solar revolution. The moon in the 10th, again, does kind of talk about the king because the people are the power of the king at this point. This is an election year. The king has to appeal to the people in the way that we do things. And so the sway of the vote is something that will be a big focus. So the topics of the 10th house of the king are what is occupying the focus of the people, the moon. All right, and so we're going to jump down to Mars now and on Mars as an indicator of the common people or of the population. And so Mars is in fourth house Aquarius, conjunct the IC, and we can return to Ramsey here, saying that, moreover, if Mars is in Aquarius and the Lord of the year, as we see here, tribulation and trouble is threatened to men during that revolution. That revolution is the revolution of the year, as I have stated it. It's not the revolution that's inevitable in the world. Whether or not that happens is not what is cited in this passage. It also indicates an abundance of rain, snow, and cold weather in the winter, and such times as it is usual. So we may have a and there is a probability of degrading and unthroning kings, great hogans of the times. So, of degrading and unthroning kings, we are enthroning a king this year. We are having an election. So I don't want to stir up fear of a certain revolt of any kind. I'm not going to say it won't happen, but I will also say that the characteristics of this are fulfilled by having an election year. Time will tell, the transits will tell what is going to happen and how boldly that is expressed. So again, just keeping in mind, we'll talk about timing a little bit later, and I will show you sort of what parts of the year I'm looking at when it comes to Mars and different plot points that may unfold in that story. So this is, again, another thing from Ramsey. He talks about hogans, and I did some research on this because I did not copy it wrong. Hogans see a reference to an old legend. And so this might be kings and great heroes. Typically, this was a great warrior of the time back in the medieval times. So this could indicate, the people that we've raised up in status by or adoration or admiring their strength in some way. Keeping that in mind, especially as this becomes a vote of popularity between the candidates and the people. Okay, so looking at Mars and the condition of Mars again, we're going to notice that Mars is in Aquarius. Aquarius is a fixed air sign. Mars is currently fast moving, is moving direct, and is visible. So even though in a weak place as far as strength in the chart, the topics of Mars, what Mars is doing this year, will be showing up in these traits. Again, fixed in air. So we're thinking air topics of intellectualism, thought. In Aquarius, this also shows up as senses of justice, of independence, of liberation and individuality, and out of the box thinking in a lot of ways as well. And so the fixity of that is I'm not really willing to change my mind or my actions on this. And they are based on my ideals, the thoughts that support my actions. So this is going to be a year where people are figuring out their ideals, figuring out the actions that they want to take based on what they believe and what is important to them, and hopefully casting a vote to do that. We also see that Mars is visible, fast, direct. So the themes of this are clearly expressed and noticeable. We will see this happen. It's going to be clear. And so again, we kind of already are. It's important to keep that in mind. Mars also is separation. That's what Mars tends to do when interacting with something. So if we take all of this together and we say how social of a sign Aquarius tends to be, and the fact that Mars is on the IC, again, the focus is on homeland, on that house topic of homeland. So we think about the separation over who gets to define society. Aquarius, separation, Mars, society, Aquarius, in the homeland, the fourth house. And you can kind of Mad Libs that together. Again, sounds like an election. Also, we do know that people are taking action the way that they feel aligned to do it. And so we always encourage people meditate on what's important to them and take the action you feel inspired towards that does no harm, ideally. Okay, and so this emphasizes that people are feeling, another Marshall term, agitated over authority, that Aquarian kind of rebelliousness, and they're actively seeking some liberation, some independence, and some justice. In fact, this week, the poll that said, what are your priorities in the election? The third from the top was actually reducing the influence of money in politics. So people saying, hey, I want to be able to actually have my say, and I want to be able to actually access my right to the influence of this office. So that is number 3. Number 1 was improving the economy. Number 2 was protecting against terrorist attacks. Very understandable. So just knowing that we are already seeing those focuses in place. And now we're going to turn to the moon. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the moon separating from the trine with the sun. And yes, we are going to acknowledge this opposition with Pluto. So the moon separating from the trine to the sun is also applying. The next application the moon will have is a square to Jupiter. It's going to take a while, but there's nobody else in the way of that. There's nobody else that the moon will talk to after separating from the sun until the moon interacts with Jupiter by square. And so again, the sun and Jupiter showing authority, and Jupiter very traditionally showing judges, priests, people of that 9th house seat is going to be there as well. And so when we think about Jupiter in the 7th, this is also where court cases tend to happen, where a lawyer would exist as well. So it would not surprising if this Jupiter in an overcoming square to the moon shows more Supreme Court topics throughout the year, as they have been for a while now. And again, the sun being the ruler in the 6th, and the people set from that trine saying, maybe we're not really as confident in this person as would have been before. And so again, this is not new, this is not unusual, but it is something that we might notice in the year. Other notable things are, again, we're going to talk about some things in just a minute. First, I want to jump into the coalescence between the Aries Ingress, which is going to be the chart on the outside here, and the Sibley chart. So the Sibley chart is the chart for America's birth. So there's some things that we want to look at here, and I'm going to make this a little bit lighter touch. We look at the fact, these charts talking to each other. What's going on? What is the relationship? The first thing that I notice is our Lord of the Year is exactly conjunct, this is called partile to the degree, with the moon of the Sibley chart. So the moon representing the people of America at the birth of the nation. And I think this is supposed to be the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So July 4th, 1776, 5:10 p.m. in Philadelphia. That is when they marked down the time and said that this is the birth of America. Other people have other thoughts on that. There's the birth of Congress. There's the Constitution. There's plenty of things to pull from. This is the one that is most commonly used and does seem to work. So that is why I'm using it here. We have Mars representing the people of this year on the moon, representing the people in general. So this, again, shows that the people are peopling this year. They are taking their influence into their hands. Noticing that the Ingress Mars is conjunct the Sibley in Aquarius. So, we've always had Aquarian people focused on society, focused on freedom and liberation. I mentioned to my mentor, and she agreed that in this case, we may notice that the people, just everybody feels attacked this year. Everybody feels like there is something about them that is being targeted by another group, another person, or something that they probably feel the impulse to defend. So we are coming into this question of who were we when we started the moon? Who were we when this nation began? Who are we now? And we're coming to this crux, this conflict of identity that comes along with that. Who do we think we are? And who are we actually? So, who do we idealize ourselves as, and who by action are we expressing as? Those are questions that may come up in the identity of America. And again, one of the major topics in politics right now is the defense of democracy or the preservation of democracy and the definition of democracy. Each side is having their own idea about that. So again, we're seeing that show up in the chart as well. We also want to notice here that the eclipses are notable again. The eclipses, as they happen this year in Aries and in Libra, will be activating the Saturn in Libra of the Sibley chart. So we have more, again, Saturn in Libra, that is very potent court kind of references here. Saturn bringing law and structure in Libra, which brings balance and is very often associated with fairness. And so you can see how perhaps, again, this emphasizes the importance of the courts this year. And already the courts have had to do a lot of work when it comes to this election in particular, and who knows what else is coming with that they will be making decisions on that, of course, impact the nation. So we also see that the Sibley moon up here, or sorry, the Sibley moon that we talked about already in the third house, by whole sign, so by sign is opposite of where the moon is this year. And so this is us, again, the people taking stock, reflecting on how far we've come, who we are, our new identities. You know, we went from Aquarius as this sort of collective idea to the individual of the Leo energy. And so what does that individuality mean for us? And what are we going to do with this influence now? And then the last thing I want to talk about, and this is a question to you as someone who is pursuing and curious about astrology. We have the ruler of the Sibley chart, which is a Sagittarius rising chart, Jupiter. Jupiter is exalted in the Sibley chart, but in the chart here, we have Jupiter in the 6th house. Knowing all of the things that we've done, go ahead and respond to this video with your interpretation of the ascendant ruler, which would represent the people of America, the ruler being in the 6th house of work, of health. And tell me what you think feels significant, or does it? Does it feel significant? Do you think that this significance between Jupiter and Uranus that will take place on April 20th will bring big change for people in America as a whole? Let me know how you feel about that one as well. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about some transits that I think will highlight the Aries Ingress chart and be very important. And of course, we talked about the outer planet transits. The one that we will notice this year is the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. The Saturn-Neptune conjunction will be taking place next year, but it draws closer and closer this year. So we will start seeing that building. So when we think about that, those are the themes that are coming up as a society that seem to be important. Also of note is that Mars, who is the ruler of the year, will be going retrograde in the signs of Cancer and Leo from December 6th to February 23rd. So that happens after the election. But of note is that Mars will, of course, at that time, around the election, have this opposition with Pluto that the moon is kind of foreshadowing here of the people wondering about change and about a whole new cycle of an era that we're bringing in. Then Mars will be there around the time of the election to bring this up again and say, we're making choices, we're taking action, we are exercising our ability to make change. Okay, and then the final thing is that the Uranus retrograde, so we were talking about Uranus and Jupiter, Uranus will reach the 27th degree of Taurus before stationing retrograde this year. So the prolific or the obvious themes of Uranus will be showing up because that station retrograde happens exactly square to the Lord of the year in the chart. So square to the 27th degree of Aquarius, Uranus will station retrograde in, let me see if I can actually bring this up. Yes, I can. Amazing. So we will actually look here together and see Uranus in September will station retrograde square to that Mars. And so in September and throughout that, we can actually go in here and really quickly look again, September through January. So over the period of election time and into the period of bringing in whatever president wins the election, we will see that Uranus retrograde also showing change, showing how we want to rewrite some of what we're doing as far as the change and the evolution that we are experiencing. So that was a lot of information. I hope it was really helpful. I hope now you've seen some of the detail that goes into the astrology of understanding the condition of the year. And there is more that I have been doing personally. When or if it becomes notable, I will bring it up to you guys, especially in the student study tier. If you are interested in doing this more often, especially every quarter of the year and looking at the condition and doing it live with me, you can join the student study tier. You will get monthly lessons in astrology and folk magic, and we will also do astrology together quarterly in our live sort of mundane call. I want to thank you for sitting with me through this longer video. And I want to just encourage you to sit with this, meditate with this, and then make your own expectations and predictions based on the astrology. And feel free to share some of that with me. Just be aware that I will be moderating the sensitivity of that in this post, because this will be available to everybody who, whether they are free Patreon or not, will have access to this video. And I want to make sure that the people who are seeing this are safe. And that is always my priority. So thank you all. I will talk to you all very soon.